Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm holiday card and tag making using the Citrus and Blooms stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps. I'm also using the Christmas words and shadow die set. Specifically, I'm using that Noel one. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stamp my images. I'm using Bristol cardstock because I plan on coloring my images with Prismacolor pencils. So I'm taking my cardstock here, cutting it down to size. So I'm cutting it, I thought I was cutting it 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch, but I actually cut 5 inches by 4 1/4 inches. I'll find that out later on when I go to trim them down for my cards. Now I am going to do one card and one tag, and the layout is going to be the same. And I just want to show you how easy it is to come up with a card or a tag and transfer it between the two of them, because it's really quite easy to do that. And I do it as a holiday tag that you could put on a gift or something, but you could easily put that tag on the front of a card as well. So I'm stamping my images onto that Bristol cardstock with black StazOn ink. This is the best ink to use for the Prismacolor pencils because I am blending them with some Gamsol and a paper stump, and we don't want that color or the ink that I'm using to stamp to be affected by that Gamsol. So by using that black StazOn, I know the ink is going to stay where I stamp it. It's not going to run in any way. So I stamp on those first two pieces of Bristol cardstock that I had trimmed down. And then I have another scrap here from a previous project. I am stamping those images again. I'm stamping each one of them 2 times just to make sure I have a nice, crisp, clean image. This one here, though, I only want those poinsettia flowers. I don't want anything else. So anything that around the outside of those poinsettias, I won't be coloring. I am going to be fussy cutting those and putting them onto my images with foam pop dots just to give it a little bit of extra dimension and just to change up the design just a little bit. I'm using some Ultra Clean to clean off that black StazOn off of my stamp. You don't want to leave that StazOn on the stamps because it can start to eat away at it. So I always clean them off after using StazOn on ink because it's a little bit more corrosive. So I have this set of 72 Prismacolor pencils here that I'm going to be using. You can use whatever colors you want, but I'll share the ones that I'm using here. So for my poinsettia, I'm going to use 924 and 925. I'm starting with the lighter color, just doing a light coat over the whole thing first. Then I'm going to use that same light color and use a heavier hand and do some of the shading. Then I'm going to go in with the darker of the two and deepen some of those shaded areas. Now I'm only going to show you coloring and blending one of the images on screen. The rest of them I'm going to do off screen because it's going to be repetitive and exactly the same as the first image. So there's no point in seeing the same thing, well, for the poinsettia's sake, 4 times. So I go in, do a light coat over that whole flower, and then I'm going to go in wherever a petal goes behind another petal. I'm going to add some shading in the center of each one of those petals. I'm going to add some shading. I want my petals to be lighter around the outside and darker towards the inside. And then when it comes time to using that darker of the 2 reds, anywhere that I already have some dark, I'm going to go into the center areas of those, if you will, and make it even darker. Now you could, if you wanted, just use one color and just change how heavy and how light-handed you are with that color. That's the great thing about Prismacolor pencils, is if you are really light-handed with them, you'll get a really light tone of that color. But if you're heavier-handed, obviously you're putting more pigment down, so you're going to get a darker tone of that color. And then if you wanted, you could get even farther in it and do other like even darker tones as well. I tend just to use 2 or 3 colors of each one. For the outer flowers for my arrangement, as well as there's a couple squirrels here, I'm going to be using number 940 and 942. These are 2 different yellows. One is really pale and one is a little bit darker, and that's where I'm going to do the shading. And just like my poinsettia, for those flowers, I'm going to do my shading towards the center of the flower. I want my petals to be lighter towards the outside and darker towards the inside. Now those flowers could be any color that you wanted them to be. I want my focus to be on that poinsettia in the center. I want to have a little bit of focus on the citrus because it's fairly unique to a Christmas arrangement, but I don't want those outer flowers. I want them to complement but not take attention away. So I am using the pale yellows for that, but you could change those colors up easily if you wanted. For my citrus, I'm using number 918 and 920. For the lighter color, I'm going in and doing the center of the orange, those little segments there, and I'm going to make them darker towards the outside of the orange and lighter towards the middle. The darker of those oranges, I'm using that to do the rind. I realized after I colored the rind that it probably should have been just that darker area towards the outside and left a little bit of area for the pith, but we're just coloring an image, so I didn't worry too much about it. After doing those oranges, I realized that there are some berries in some of that greenery and I wanted them to be the same red as the poinsettia. So I do those the same way as the poinsettia, going in with the lighter of the reds first, then going in with the darker of the reds where I figured there should be some shadow. And typically that's where the berry attaches to the stem of the plant. For my greenery, I'm using number 912 and 913. And again, I'm going to do the lighter color all over the greenery areas. Then I'm going to use the darker of the greens to put some darker areas towards where the stem of the leaf meets that leaf. So I do pretty much the same technique for anytime I'm coloring. Even when I'm coloring with Copics, it's pretty much the same. My greenery, my leaves are darker where that stem meets the leaf. My petals are darker where towards the center of my flowers. Another way you could do it is thinking of where the light would be touching it. This is just the way that works the best for me. It's logical for me. So after doing the greeneries with just those two greens, I thought it needed a little bit more deepening of the greens. They were just a little bit too bright in my opinion. So I went and I grabbed 909 and just did some heavier coloring where some of those leaves went underneath the petals or underneath other leaves, just darkening that color a little bit, making it more of a winter green rather than say a spring green. I didn't color over the entire leaves. I just went over where the darker colors were, just deepening some of those areas. Now that I have my image colored here, we're ready to start blending those colors together. So as I said before, I'm using a paper stump and I'm also using some Gamsol. I have a piece of sanding paper here. Anytime I need to change a color or take any pigment off of that paper stump, I use that sandpaper to do it. And I just keep reusing this and I will keep reusing it until there's not really an area to sand off that paper stump. This one here is 400 grit. You can probably just use whatever you have. This is just a piece that I had in my craft room, so it worked well for me. Now, when I'm blending my colors out, I start with the lighter of the color. So I start with that yellow, and in just those yellows, I start where the color is the lightest first, blend those areas in all of those petals. Then I go and I blend in the darker of the yellows into the lighter. If you start with the darker of the yellows, you're going to just blend that darker color over the whole flower or whole petal, especially because these areas are fairly small. So I always start where the lighter colors are first and then work my way to the darker shades of that color. After doing the yellow, I'm going to do the orange, and then I go in to do the reds. Now the red is a really dark pigment. It's really hard to get all of that red off of that paper stump. So again, just like the rest of the colors, I start with the lighter areas of those reds. Then I go into where the reds are darker and then where it's darkest. So I kind of work my way from light to dark within each color, as well as working my way from the light colors to the dark colors. So after doing this red, I have to really make sure that I clean off that paper stump really, really well with the sandpaper. So I tend to just dip it in the Gamsol and then use it on the sandpaper. You don't necessarily have to do that. It just seems to be habit, and I do it every single time, and every single time I do it, I'm like, well, I don't know why I just did that. So when it comes to making sure all of that pigment is off, I'm going to take one of my pieces here. This is the piece that I plan on fussy cutting. So there's a lot of area around it that I don't need for my project. I'm going to test that paper stump on there to make sure all of my color is gone. If by chance it's not gone, I will go back in with that sandpaper and sand it off some more. I don't want to accidentally have a little bit of red on there and put it onto my leaves, because red and green make brown. So then I would have some brown streaks in my leaves. So I want to make sure that it is completely cleaned off before going into the green. So when I go into the green, just like all of the other colors, I do the lightest area of the green first, then kind of the medium area, because this time we used 3 different green shades, and then I go in and I do the dark ones. So after that, I put that to the side and I did the other images off screen. Again, it's exactly the same as that first image. So once I've done that, any Gamsol that I have left, I can pour that right back into the jar so there's no waste to it. And then I use my detail scissors and I cut out those poinsettias. Now when I do fussy cutting, you'll notice that my scissors in my right hand really don't change direction a whole lot. What does change direction is the paper in my left hand. So I will use my left hand to wheel and stir that paper or steer that paper around so that it works with the blade on my scissors. That's the best way to get really good at fussy cutting, is your scissors pretty much don't move and it's the paper that moves, not the scissors. That way as well, you're not, having those scissors facing you and facing all sorts of areas. The easiest way is to move the paper. My scissors may move from left to right slightly, but in general, they're in the same direction for all of that fussy cutting. And you can see as well as I'm doing that fussy cutting that anytime I finish or do it that one of those little V notches inside those petals, I cut that piece entirely off. It makes it so much easier because while I'm cutting, I'm not fighting with paper that is attached on the outside of my image. By cutting it off, it just makes it easier to do that fussy cutting. So I've kind of gotten into the habit of that. I don't need to have all of that excess waste stuck to the outside edge. So now that my fussy cutting is done, I want to do a little bit of ink blending on my backgrounds. Now, I knew I wanted to do it with Tumbled Glass and Uncharted Mariner, but I wasn't sure if it was going to cover up my coloring too much. So I did a little bit of coloring with my two yellows on a piece of the scrap, and I wanted to see how well the colors would be visible through it. And you can see that it does darken it just a little bit, but I still can see those colors. So that little test there was a success. That way I don't have to work on my actual project and possibly ruin it because I thought it would resist it a little bit and it didn't. So now that I know that that is going to work, I can trim down one of my floral arrangements here to create my tag. Now I'm using the 3-in-1 tag punch from Spellbinders. It can create a tag 1.5 inches wide, 2 inches wide, or 2.5 inches wide. So I cut my strip 2.5 inches wide, and then I just punch the end of it. So it works really, really quick and easy to create that tag. Then I'm going to do my ink blending on my background. I'm going to start with that tumbled glass, doing a light coat over the whole thing. And then I want the darker area to be behind my floral arrangement there. But I realized I might as well do the ink blending on both first. And to do that, I need to trim down my other piece. So I trimmed that down so it is 5 inches by 3 3/4 inches. That's when I discovered that it was 5 inches in length already, that I hadn't trimmed it to 5.5 inches. I go and do the tumbled glass on the background for that. And once that one is done, I can go in with that Uncharted Mariner and really darken the areas behind my floral arrangement here. Now the other option here would be to keep the area behind the florals lighter and then just do the edges of the tag or the edges of the area around my poinsettia. Do that with the Uncharted Mariner. I did this one because it was a little bit different than the way I normally did it, but that is also an option. If you want it to be lighter behind your floral arrangement and then do it darker around the outside edges, that will work as well. So after doing that, I used a clean microfiber cloth just to remove any ink that's possibly on top of my coloring, just to brighten that up a little bit. You can see it did darken it a little bit, but it also lightened up after I used that microfiber cloth on there. I wanted my tag as well as my colored piece for my card to have a gold edge around it. You could use gold cardstock, but one of the easiest ways is to use a gold Posca marker here and just go right around the edges of the cardstock. It creates a nice frame for it, makes it look like it has a really narrow mat underneath it, but it's just an illusion. For my card, I want to create another mat for it, and I'm going to do this with some Raven cardstock. So I trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, glue that onto my A2 card base, created with some classic white cardstock here. Then I put my acrylic block on there. I always use that acrylic block to hold things down while I'm assembling other things or putting glue on other things. It just holds it down nice and flat and frees up my hands. So once I have my image piece down, I'm ready to add my fussy cut poinsettia. Now you could glue it straight onto the card and the tag, but I thought it would be nice to have a little bit of dimension to it. So I'm using some foam pop dots. These ones aren't really thick, they're fairly thin, but it's just going to give it a little bit of extra dimension on there. Now you have two options here. You can glue it exactly as the stamped image below is, or you can twist it a little bit and it's going to give it just a little bit more visual dimension. So that's what I choose to do. I choose to twist it just a little bit so that it looks like there's some petals underneath that didn't get fussy cut, but really it was just twisting that flower, giving it that illusion there. So I'm going to do the same thing with my tag. I'm going to match it up first and then just twist it a little bit so my petals go in between the petals below there. Again, it just gives the illusion that that flower is fuller than it actually is. Now I have some petals here that go over the edge. You could leave them there if you want for a different look, but I just use my shears to cut them off. And then I'm using some Glisten stickles in the middle of that poinsettia as well as the middle of the other flowers. Now Glisten stickles is transparent, but it does have gold little flecks in there. So it's a little bit more subtle than say like gold stickles or platinum stickles. Those are more opaque and metallic. So I wanted the focus to be more the florals and not necessarily what's in the center of the poinsettia. I wanted that to have just a little bit of shimmer and shine, but by using the Glisten, it's just a little bit more subtle. Then I went with my glossy accents and just went over the berries that are in the cluster of greenery around that. I let that dry completely for probably about a half an hour or so, and this is where we're at. Now you could leave these as is, they look fantastic, but I wanted to add that Noel sentiment. So my shadow is going to be with black cardstock. I have some Raven cardstock scraps here. And then I wanted my Noel to be with gold cardstock. Well, I don't have any matte gold cardstock at the moment, so I create my own using the Lisa Horton gold ink pad, just covering a scrap of white cardstock by swiping that pad on it, letting that dry for a few moments, and then I can die cut those pieces out. I'm going to do the same Noel sentiment on both my tag as well as my card, but that die set also has Merry Christmas or it has peace, so you could change it and do different sentiments if you want them to have different sentiments. I opted to do the same just so that you could see exactly what the same design on the card and the tag would look like. So after die cutting those pieces, I can use my Barely Art glue to glue the letters onto the shadow. Now I chose black cardstock for my shadow because it coordinated with the ink I used to stamp my images as well as the matte around the outside edges of the card, but I think white would also look great. So if you wanted it to be a little bit brighter, you could easily just use white cardstock for that shadow. Or you could even just use those letters on their own, but I do always like a shadow behind it. So I want my sentiment to be a little bit dimensional as well. So I am using some foam pop dots on here and I'm going to have it covering the flower just a little bit. Now, because that flower has foam pop dots on it, under my N, I have one foam pop dot, and under the L, I have two layered on top of each other just to accommodate for the pop dots that are under the poinsettia. So I do the same for both the card as well as the tag. That way they're going to be nice and even, and I'm not going to have a crooked or sentiment that is a little bit lower in one area than the other. To finish off my tag, I have some gold cord here that I just want to put through that hole and then tied on the end. So here we have a card as well as a tag that work perfectly for the holidays. And like I said before, you could take this tag and put it on the front of a card if you wanted to use it as a design feature on a card. But it's so easy to do the same exact elements and take it from a card and adapt it to a holiday tag. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.